Welcome to Religion in the American Experience, a podcast that explores how religion has shaped America and how America has shaped religion, which can help us as we wrestle with complex questions of American governance and purpose in the 21st century. Here's your host, Chris Stevenson.
Hello, and welcome to another episode of Religion in the American Experience, the podcast that equips listeners to be more effective stewards of religion's role in the American experiment in self-government. During America's semiquincentennial, we are exploring the religious lives of the founding era's principal actors. Today, our subject is Benjamin Franklin, and our guest is Dr. Tommy Kidd, who is among the most celebrated scholars of religion and the founding of the United States. Tommy serves as research professor of church history at Midwestern Baptist Theological Seminary and is the John and Sharon Yeats Endowed Chair of Baptist Studies. Dr. Kidd has authored numerous books, including Thomas Jefferson, A Biography of Spirit and Flesh, and Benjamin Franklin, The Religious Life of a Founding Father. Tommy, thank you so much for sharing your time and your hard-earned knowledge of the subject matter.
Thanks for having me.
So let's just jump right in. Early in the book, you write that most of his religion, Ben Franklin's religion, came from his father, Josiah, and Uncle Benjamin. What exactly was Benjamin's religious upbringing, and how did this influence him at a young age?
Yeah, well, Franklin grew up in a Puritan family in Boston, and his family had come from England under some duress and persecution in the 1680s, like a lot of Puritans did during the 1600s. They came to New England, and so when Franklin was born in the early 1700s, that meant that he grew up in a pretty intense religious environment with a lot of focus on church attendance, of course, and most people in Massachusetts at that time were in church, certainly every week.
Sure.
And his family was going multiple times a week, hearing lengthy sermons, heavily doctrinal. And he says in his autobiography that he had read the whole Bible through by the time he was 5, which is pretty precocious. But with Franklin, I tend to believe it. And so I think that leaves just a permanent imprint on his mind and his thinking, and just his later career, even though he develops skepticism about traditional Christian doctrine.
Yeah. So before we get to his teenage years, where you write that his faith in the Bible and Reformed theology was crumbling, I want to get to that. Maybe describe for us briefly what would Franklin's religious outlook be coming out of that Puritan upbringing before it started to crumble? What would be his sort of high-level thoughts about God and religion?
Sure. I mean, obviously, just sort of traditional Orthodox Christian doctrine in many ways, but also Calvinism and belief in predestination of people to salvation, that it's God's choice, it's God's initiative to save, and not people's initiative, and certainly a very high view of God's sovereign control over the universe and over human life, and that contrasts to some extent with what Franklin comes to believe as a self-described deist.
Okay, fantastic. So now at age 15, so what happened here, Tommy, and how did this play out in his teenage and early 20s years when he sort of left the faith of his fathers? Maybe that's too strong, but he crumbled a bit.
Well, doctrinally, he definitely does leave his parents' faith. He is apprenticed to his older brother, who is a printer, and Franklin comes from a modest family, so they don't have a lot of books besides the Bible. And working in his brother's print shop means that Franklin has access effectively to kind of a personal library of things that his brother is publishing, and through that and other ways, Franklin is able to get access to, among many other kinds of books, he starts to read deistic, skeptical tracts and books by people like Anthony Ashley Cooper, who are questioning traditional Christian faith of the sort that his parents hold, um, and raising questions about the authority of the Bible, uh, arguing that a lot of the, doctrinal squabbles of the previous, 200 years between Catholics and Protestants are sort of pointless and nonsensical. And Franklin, by his teen years, is being persuaded by those kinds of arguments. And as he tells the story in his autobiography, his father is worried about him. Both his parents are worried about him, and what's happening to him. And so his father starts to give him anti-deist things to read. And that Franklin says that reading the anti-deist stuff actually helped him to become even more of a confirmed deist, because he just thought the anti-deists, the Christian writers, didn't have a strong argument. And so he says that he became a thorough deist.
Okay. So deism, that comes up a lot when people talk about Franklin's religion. Can you give us a definition, what it is and what it isn't?
Yeah, well, deism is confusing because it can mean a lot of different things in the 1700s. It certainly means some kind of rejection of traditional belief, or at least of Calvinism. So, you couldn't be like a Calvinist deist. There would be no way to do
Right.
that. But it doesn't necessarily mean a radical skepticism. And a lot of people think that deism only means that this view that God is the cosmic watchmaker, who wound up the world and got it going, but now has kind of departed and is doing something else, but is not really involved in the world's affairs or human life. And I think that Franklin probably went through a phase where that's pretty much what he believed in his teens and 20s.
Okay.
But later in life, he clearly comes back, at least at times, to a providentialist view.
Yeah.
But I don't think that necessarily means that he's not a deist anymore. I think it means that there are providentialist deists,
Right.
which a lot of observers would find surprising.
Okay. All right. So that's helpful. When he's in his early 20s, he writes something called his Articles of Belief and Acts of Religion, which one scholar said was the most important religious document Franklin ever wrote. Um, what is important in this document to understand regarding Franklin's religion, Tommy, at that time in his life, let's
Yeah,
say?
yeah. I don't think it's probably the most important thing that he ever wrote on religion, but it certainly is fascinating, and it shows that in those years that Franklin is in a very speculative mode about theology and doctrine and who God is, or more specifically, who the gods are. And so
Yes, he does use
it
the
has kind
plural,
of
doesn't
a polytheistic sort of argument he's making. Now, I mean, with Franklin, the the trouble with Franklin about his theology is that he's very difficult to pin down, because a lot of times what he says is either speculative or it's satirical.
he? Yeah.
And so Franklin can be really elusive about what he actually believes. And I think for much of his life, he I guess you would say he's kind of an agnostic, because he genuinely isn't sure what he believes for a lot of his adult life, where somebody like Jefferson is a skeptic, but much clearer about what he does and doesn't believe. So anyway, in the Articles of Belief, Franklin, among other things, says that he thinks it could be that there is a supreme creator God, but that God is so transcendent, that we really don't have access to that God in terms of being able to pray to that God, or really know much about that God other than that he's creator. Um,
Yeah.
and that there are lesser gods, that uh, who, when we talk about God, it's sort of a lesser God that we actually have access to. And so he posits the God the Father in traditional Christian belief might be one of those lesser gods that we
I
can
see.
actually know more specific things about. So, I guess that's a form of polytheism. It's not totally clear about whether the creator God created those lesser gods or whatever, but that that is Franklin in kind of his most speculative religious
Okay.
mode.
Okay. That's early 20s. Um, you write that he became somewhat of a important authority on religion in Philadelphia into his 30s. And then you write this, which I found important because it marks a change. You write, quote, the 33-year-old had sought to craft a public persona of virtue and industry, but some events threatened to undo his image. He was at risk of becoming known as a scandalous heretic. This would not do. The year 1739 marked a turning point as Franklin began muting his skeptical opinions on religion, close quote. Can you elaborate here a little bit on this? Seems like a really important turn in his sort of persona, at least public.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, he's of course he's in his 30s by this point, so he's well into adulthood, but I think he had sort of burned out on his, early extreme skepticism.
Okay.
And he was also in many ways living a dissolute life. And I mean, he's pretty open in his autobiography about going to prostitutes and he ends up with a child who we don't know who the mother is. And there's just a lot of things happening for him that he I think decides he needs to sort of get his act together. And for Franklin, that means becoming known as someone who is virtuous, and has a kind of religious system that's not just um, skepticism. And
Yeah.
he had gotten involved in debates in Philadelphia. He ultimately ends up fleeing his brother's printing practice because his brother, among other things, would beat him as his apprentice. It was kind of the worst job possible, and uh,
Yeah.
and and so he ends up going to London for a while, and then back to Philadelphia, and um, he starts to craft this kind of virtue centered moralistic only moralistic type of Christianity, where of course, it develops over time. But he thinks that the thing you want to do is focus on Jesus's ethics, and not worry about all these doctrinal claims about the Trinity and salvation by grace alone and things like that. That it's so much fighting had happened about, and that I think becomes very characteristic of his religion for the rest of his life.
Yeah, I was going to ask about that. That there does seem to be a huge link between his idea of virtue being so important and his religion. They were sort of intertwined. That was his religion in some ways, to be virtuous, right?
Yeah, and I think he would say, I mean, Franklin has little expertise in non-Christian religions, but he says, look, I mean, most of the religions that we know emphasize similar systems of morality, but they have very different, doctrines of
Yeah.
God, and so he thinks that in a very Enlightenment kind of comparative religion type of way that we should focus on the ethics. He would say that Jesus's ethics were the superior
Mhm.
ethical system that we've ever seen in world history, and so that really is the heart of true religion. It's what God wants for us is to live that kind of virtuous life, and so why not focus on that rather than the specifics of doctrine?
Yeah. Okay. Tommy, Franklin was friends with the hugely influential evangelist preacher of the First Great Awakening, George Whitefield. They were friends for years, beginning in the 1730s until he died, Whitefield, at 55. This was business related, definitely, but also they became friends and they talked a lot about religion. What do their interactions and communications reveal about Franklin's own religion?
Yeah, it's really a fascinating relationship, and some listeners may know that there was a recent kind of Christian themed movie about their relationship, which it's not a great movie, but there was a movie nevertheless,
Yeah,
A Great Awakening, and so the way this plays out is that by the late 1730s, Franklin is a publisher in Philadelphia, and he takes the London newspapers and he starts to get these reports about this celebrity preacher George Whitefield, who at that time is operating in London and England, and then he learns that Whitefield is coming to America. So Franklin had been a lot of the news coverage in America was just stuff that was cut and pasted from London newspapers. So he had been covering Whitefield for several years before he actually met Whitefield. And by the time Whitefield does his first big tour in America, starting in 1739, Whitefield is one of the most famous people in Anglo-America, where Franklin is becoming well known in Philadelphia, but otherwise he's not famous. And so Franklin sees Whitefield as a big business opportunity, and wants to become his lead publisher in America. And Whitefield, conversely, is very media savvy, like all great evangelists have always been media savvy. And so when he comes to Philadelphia, a conversation happens where Whitefield is kind of asking around about who's the best media man, who's the best publisher that I can work with in Philadelphia. Not the best Christian publisher, but the best publisher,
yeah,
period. And so they connect, and it ends up being a fabulously lucrative arrangement for Franklin. And really, one of the main reasons why Franklin is able to retire early from publishing is because of his publishing relationship with Whitefield. So he publishes Whitefield's sermons and probably most importantly, his travel journals, which are probably the most popular things that Whitefield writes, so the very spiritual themed travel
yeah,
journals. And but Franklin publishes anti-Whitefield stuff, just anything, and Whitefield's fine with it because it just means more publicity for the gospel and
right.
Whitefield's preaching. So it does start as a business relationship that's a very good relationship for both sides, but they become friends. I wouldn't want to overstate it. I mean, they don't see each other very often, and they write, about business things to each other, but they're clearly friends for a long time. And when Whitefield dies, even though Franklin is older than Whitefield dies, as you said, at a relatively young age, and Franklin writes very tenderly about his love for Whitefield as a longtime friend, and Franklin talks with his sister Jane Mecom, who is his closest sibling and who is also an evangelical Christian, about how much they love and respect Whitefield. When Whitefield, and this is private correspondence. I mean, it's not anything that is meant for public
Right.
consumption. So it
Yeah.
seems very candid and sincere how much Franklin admired Whitefield, even though they're not on the same page as far as Christian doctrine.
Yeah. I do recall that Whitfield, I don't know how often, but in your book, you describe how he would ask Franklin to become converted, to have the born again experience, and then Franklin's response. That just seemed very interesting. They kept that friendship. It was good enough where Whitfield could say that and Franklin could respond. What were Franklin's responses, and what was the significance of that in your mind? What did that tell us about Franklin's religion?
Yeah, I mean the best one is in the 1750s where Whitefield. So Franklin by that point is becoming famous because of his electrical experiments, So Whitefield says, I'm paraphrasing, but he says, Mr. Franklin, I congratulate you on your progress in the studies of the mysteries of electricity. Now I urge you to consider the mysteries of the new birth in Christ. And, and Franklin basically tells him, I'm all set. I'm just fine. And what he means is I'm pursuing Christian virtue. And that's what God really wants for all of us. Now, I think Franklin would have said if having a conversion experience leads to more virtue, then that's great. I'm all for that. But he doesn't think that it's necessary for him.
Mm.
And it's not necessary to salvation, he thinks, whatever salvation means. And so Whitefield, keeps at it, but in such a way that they're able to maintain their friendship, which I think is kind of an inspiring example of
Yeah.
people who are able to be friends even though they have different religious views.
No, I agree. Absolutely. And his sister was sort of the same with him. I would often ask about his conversion and things. Obviously
Yeah,
different because they're siblings, but
right. Yeah, I think Jane is more willing to believe that Franklin is sort of okay religiously
yeah.
than Whitefield is. I mean,
Got it. Okay.
Whitefield I mean, he knows that Franklin is not born again, and that's really the center of Whitefield's whole ministry is trying to get people to accept God's grace for
Yeah.
salvation.
Yep. Yep. You have this statement in your book from Franklin that reveals what you described, but I'm going to read it anyways, and you can elaborate if you wish. Franklin said this about his religion, quote, "Doing good to men is the only service of God in our power, and to imitate his beneficence is to glorify him," close quote. That really, for me, summarizes at this point in his life. I don't know, this is probably in the, I don't know, 60s or 70s, 50s or 60s, 1750s or 60s, but at that time, it sort of summarizes it for me. Anything to say about that? Any elaboration on that statement?
Yeah, I mean, it shows that he has, a moralistic but doctrineless effect. I mean, you have to believe in God, I guess. I mean, I don't,
Right.
that it seems like that's the one essential doctrine. But and I mean, I guess believing that Jesus is, a uniquely authoritative moral teacher. But beyond that, there's nothing that's essential. It's just how you live, and so Franklin, of course, famously has these charts that he would keep about how well he's doing with the virtues. I have to admit I'm a little skeptical about keeping track of like how humble you are, and I mean I'm not sure Franklin was especially successful about that, but
Yeah.
I think it is something that um, is a kind of characteristic enlightenment type of religion that is a downplaying almost to zero of what doctrines are essential, and just saying, love, charity, kindness to neighbor, and all these kind of things is what Christianity really is about.
I think you used a term in the book, and I couldn't find it in preparing for this, but it was something like he believed in a doctrineless Christianity or something. There was some
Yeah,
other word in there, but I think you just described that.
yeah.
Okay. What were his evolving views on the white, black, and Native American races uh, in terms of what light they cast on his religious outlook? Is there something there for us to understand?
Yeah, I mean, in some of his writings, he would talk about, again, a kind of comparative religion thing with, especially with Native Americans, that he knew that they had their, creation stories and systems of religious belief, and he just didn't understand the kind of concept of Christians coming and telling them, well, you're wrong, we're right, and so your religion has to be replaced, by ours. But again, a lot of times these are satirical pieces,
Yeah.
kind of poking fun at Christians who think that, they have all, doctrinal truth at their disposal, and that others don't. And so it's an example, I think, of how comparative religion is often a sort of entryway into having that kind of Enlightenment type of view of religious truth or religious pluralism. Um, and then with African Americans, I mean, I don't think that he necessarily thought as much about African American systems of belief, but one of the great problems with Franklin's career, like a lot of the founders, is his involvement with slavery. Franklin often is credited, I suppose correctly, with getting involved in the anti-slavery movement. But we do have to remember that was at the very end of his life. I mean,
Yeah.
he spent almost no time being anti-slavery. He spent his whole adult life basically as a slave owner. And there's some evidence to suggest that he certainly was advertising for slaves for sale and runaway slaves in his newspaper, and he may have even been selling slaves himself in Philadelphia at times. So I think on that score, it's the same with Whitefield. Is a huge problem with Whitefield and slavery, and I think in American lore, he probably gets a little too much credit for, being anti-slavery, but he did come around,
Yeah.
to the right position at the end of his life.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. This was interesting. When he was in Europe, he learned his second time going over there, he learned a lot about Catholicism, and it seemed to change. You write that it changed his religious views a bit. Tell us what we need to know here, Tommy.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think he was struck, as almost all visitors to Europe were, by the architectural achievements and beauty of the institutional Roman Catholic Church, and he
Yeah.
was also shocked by the lack of Sabbath observance that was pervasive in Europe, since keeping the Sabbath in a strict way is not an important part of the Roman Catholic tradition. And so, he tells a story of being, I think, in Holland or something, and he's, seeing all these people, buying and selling
Yeah.
and playing sports on the Sabbath, and he sort of, instinctively covers his head, waiting for the judgment to drop, and realizes, oh, these people are going along violating the Sabbath, and everything seems to be fine, which for, a Puritan boy is just kind of a shocking realization, even though, by that point he had left behind the strictures of Puritanism, but he sort of still had it in his bones.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. And that's on the backdrop of the colonies at that time very much sort of existing almost as an anti-Catholic extension of the British Empire, and so I think that was an important thing that he sort of experienced. Okay, so moving on, at least in his 50s, if not later, Franklin wrote about the cost of unbelief in a society, which I thought was interesting. And I'm quoting your book here. If men are so wicked as we now see them with religion, what would they be if without it? Can you share, Tommy, what this tells us about his view of religion's role in society?
Yeah, I mean, he definitely, by older age, is convinced of a kind of social utility view of religion, that even if, you know, you're professing views that are not necessarily essential, or maybe even true, but that there's still I mean, there's a kind of social glue to religion and Christianity in particular, that if there isn't the ethos of, love God and love your neighbor, the kind of sacrificial, loving ethos of Christianity, that people will just be given over to, viciousness and selfishness, and it will be the death of the republic. And that definitely was the view of people like George Washington, that and John Adams, that we just cannot do without a kind of, strong religious infrastructure as a society. And so, there's this famous, possibly apocryphal anecdote about, when they got done at the Constitutional Convention, someone asked Franklin, "Have you created a monarchy or a republic, and he said, a republic, if you can keep it.
Yeah.
And I think in that famous phrase, you kind of hear it's up to the people to be the kind of people who can sustain a republic, and that means a virtuous people.
Yeah. Yep. Okay. Thank you. And we'll get into more of this. We're bringing him into his later years. We're getting into the Revolutionary era. And so we'll talk a little bit more about this. But I want to bring up this, which I had not seen. When he was 60, so this is in the 1760s, he updated the Lord's Prayer for himself. And to me, the last line seems to be the most substantial change, and the one I want to talk about briefly. And that was from lead us not into temptation, to keep us out of temptation. So that's significant. What does this tell us, Tommy, about his religious outlook?
Yeah, I mean, it probably is not an entirely accurate. It's a paraphrase, a Franklin paraphrase of that line.
Yes.
But it speaks to Franklin's. I mean, he's doing things like paraphrasing the Lord's Prayer, and I mean, the Lord's Prayer is kind of one of those essential Christian texts that he would see as really, really important and central and valuable. But you see that he's very theologically astute. And so he I think it signals that he was always bothered by this concept that God would lead people into temptation.
Yeah.
And that's, I don't believe, that a benevolent God would, somehow play games with people. I mean, this is Franklin's view on it, that
Right.
somehow almost inciting them to sin and then blaming them for sinning. He just That's
Yeah.
not what God does. So the real meaning of that verse is God, keep us out of temptation. I mean, if we sin, it's our fault. It's not God's fault.
Right.
And God wouldn't, lead us into temptation because it's just contrary to his character. But I think it also shows that Franklin does not think Scripture is perfect in lots of different ways. I mean, you learn enough about God and about Jesus's moral teachings to live, the kind of religious life that God wants us to live, but he doesn't think that Scripture is entirely authoritative and from God.
And I think that comes out in his work with the Pennsylvania Constitution, and the requirement some people wanted to swear an oath on the Bible, that he said, well, it's not perfect. So anyway, we might get to that. Okay.
Yeah.
Let's look briefly at his work with the Declaration of Independence. Of course, very important this year. And you write that he was on the committee, I think, with Jefferson to create the Declaration, to write the Declaration. He didn't change much with Jefferson's draft, but he did change this one thing, and maybe there were a few others, but I noted this one. He changed Jefferson's "We hold these truths to be sacred and undeniable," which is foreign to us, except for the first part, to what we now hear, "We hold these truths to be self-evident." So from sacred and undeniable from Jefferson to self-evident, which stuck from Franklin. Where is this coming from, Tommy, and why do you think he felt this was so important?
Yeah, I mean, we don't get the, a record of the debates on the committee or anything like that, but I think Jefferson's inclination was to make the Declaration overall more religious, not Christian. I mean, it's not in no way is the Declaration explicitly Christian, but it is theological in
Yeah.
very important ways. And the Continental Congress wanted it to be have a theological tone and acknowledging God, from first to last, so much so that the Congress added some references to God at the end. Um, and but there, however that played out, I think that they decided to go in a more rationalistic direction, and in particular, that self-evident truths is a hallmark of Scottish common sense philosophy that is not anti-religious, but it's the idea is that reason and revelation show the same truths about
Mm.
human nature and about God and the creation and so forth. And so, even if you don't accept the everything about Scripture, that there are certain truths that are just self-evident because they're common to the human experience, they're revealed in nature, and they're confirmed by Scripture. And so, deleting sacred, undeniable and self-evident are pretty similar terms, but deleting sacred doesn't
Yes. Right.
necessarily mean, this is not affirmed by Scripture, but in the balance between revelation and reason, they're going totally in the direction of reason there.
Yeah. Yeah. I thought that was fascinating. Never heard that. So thank you. Good stuff to think about. Okay. And then he, independent of Thomas Jefferson, who was doing the same thing, suggested the Great Seal of the United States be Moses on the shore of the Red Sea, asking God to inundate Pharaoh and his pursuing army. About this, you write, quote, the skeptical child of the Puritans still wanted to remind America of how God shepherded human events, close quote. Anything more to say here, Tommy?
Well, it's a great example, and there are others of that providentialism
Yeah,
that comes out, especially late in life, with Franklin, but also Jefferson. I mean,
sure.
that I think by the time you get to the Revolution and the Constitution, that whatever anti-providentialist, kind of deism is left among the founders becomes really muted. And I think that it speaks to Jefferson and Franklin's. I mean, they wouldn't want to make, really dogmatic statements about how God providentially led America, but I think they're all just. I mean, they had to go through so much in the Revolution that they're just struck by, God is in this somehow. And
Yeah,
and the Exodus narrative is just the perfect kind of motif for the national seal, a kind of defining national narrative of liberation from captivity, and the parallel of Pharaoh to King George, and it just worked really well. And they also knew that if that was the national seal, that would be very broadly acceptable to the American people, who, at least white people, are overwhelmingly, at least nominally, Christian, with some Jews who would also find it, an appropriate motif. So it also politically would work well to have that be the national seal, even though that's ultimately not what we chose.
yeah. Okay. Once, and I mentioned this previously, but once independence was declared, Franklin helped Pennsylvania draft its own constitution, including framing the state's religious freedom framework. What are the important points about this, and what insights do they offer into Franklin's religion? What does he do there?
Yeah, well, I mean, usually with the new state constitutions, there are a couple of questions that they have to answer. One is whether there will be an established church in the state or not. In Pennsylvania, even though it had been Quaker dominated from the beginning, it had never actually had an official state church. The Quaker church was not the established tax supported denomination. It had no established church. So that was not really the question in Pennsylvania the way it was in Massachusetts, for instance. And Franklin commented on Massachusetts as well. But in Pennsylvania, what comes to the fore more as far as, quote, an establishment is whether there would be test oaths for office holders. And Pennsylvania decided to have test oaths, as you suggested, affirming the truth of the Bible. And Franklin was opposed to that. I would say, among the major founders, probably they're split about 50-50 on those kind of issues. I mean,
Yeah,
there's not really a dominant pro or anti-establishment view, but Franklin, Madison, and Jefferson would definitely be on the anti-establishment side. And lots of evangelical Christians were opposed to having state establishments of religion, especially the Baptists, because Baptists were never the
Right.
establishment
They'd
and
be
they were
out. Yeah.
sort of despised and persecuted, and so they always thought established churches were a bad idea. But Franklin, in particular, said if a religion is true, then it doesn't need state backing to support it. It will be better to just leave religion alone, um, to stand on its own merits. And so he didn't want office holders to be forced to affirm things like the authority of the Bible, and Franklin, really couldn't, with a clear conscience, affirm it himself. So
Right.
that is
Yeah.
also part of the problem that he has with it, is that this would exclude people like me if I was honest about my view of the Bible.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. I'm going to read Franklin's formal statements of belief written in his 70s. And then I want you to comment on them or add things, give us context if it's helpful for us to understand his religion better. 1, that there is one God who created the universe and who governs it by his providence. 2, that he ought to be worshiped and served. 3, that the best service to God is doing good to men. 4, that the soul of man is immortal. And 5, that in a future life, if not in the present one, vice will be punished and virtue rewarded. Tommy, can you add anything here that would help our listeners best understand these?
Well, I mean, you can see there that he's come around. I mean, this is a long way from the articles of belief where he's, speculating about kind of polytheistic thing. I mean, so now it's one true God. Um, I think, he would say we know things about that God. Um, it's fairly aggressive for Franklin to affirm that the souls of people are immortal,
Okay.
that there's an eternal life, there's life after death, and that people will be judged when they die, by God. I mean, that's some fairly conventional,
Yeah.
Judeo-Christian kind of belief. Um, and so uh, it shows that he's come a pretty long way back towards what his parents would have affirmed. However, he still hasn't come back on the idea that Jesus is the Son of God. He still doesn't believe that the Bible is fully authoritative, and he wouldn't affirm the Trinity and
Right.
specific Christian doctrines like that. So I don't want to say that he's somehow responded to Whitfield's
Right. Or his sisters. Yeah.
pleas, as the movie kind of sort of implies that Franklin came all the way back. I don't think we have any evidence to suggest that. However, I mean, I think just even affirming a future judgment, is pretty aggressive, and it's not, and it's one of those moments where Franklin is affirming something as his belief, and he's not joking, he's not being satirical, he's not being evasive. He pretty well, puts his foot in the ground and says, this is what I believe. And I think that's illustrative of kind of where Franklin ended up at the end of his life, which is, I don't know, halfway back towards his parents' faith.
Right. You call it a tether, and I think you use that term with Jefferson. I mean, they grew up in a certain religious landscape, especially within the family, and that doesn't break, right? It stretches
Yeah,
and is elastic, but it tethers some. So you see sort of Calvinistic things in these, plus his experience, plus his enlightenment, plus his skepticism. So
yeah,
yeah.
yeah.
Okay, last few questions. The Revolutionary War, according to you, Tommy, seemed to really darken Franklin's view of humanity. And of this, you write, quote, the early 1780s then saw Franklin gravitating back toward Calvinist views of human depravity and of providential interpretations of history, close quote. This is reflected in some of his statements of belief. Um, Anything more you can tell us about what the war, which was surprising, I didn't know this, what the war did to Franklin religiously?
Yeah, I mean, Franklin's experience of the war was obviously really taxing for him personally. And he's, in England until desperately trying to, get solve the conflict between England and the colonies, and then when the war starts, um, he's horrified by how willing the British are to uh, kill and destroy in order to keep independence from happening. Obviously, that's the experience of a lot of Americans, but he's disgusted with the British administration. He's disgusted with the king, and I think, sort of reaches to the shelf of that kind of depravity of human nature a bit, and says, well, we're just seeing, Calvin's view of human nature kind of play out here. I mean, he doesn't cite Calvin for it, but
Right.
he has that memory of he had been taught as a boy that people are not naturally good. In fact, they're, spiritually, they're totally depraved. They're hostile to God, and that when the mask is, torn off, that you can see what people's real nature is. And so I think the revolution kind of brought him back to those kind of grittier realities that he had learned about as a boy about what people were really like when they're given a chance.
Yeah. Yeah. Um, okay. So we move from the Revolutionary War, independence declared, War One, uh, and now Constitutional Convention. This is a well-known anecdote, and it is of Franklin proposing a motion for prayer to help the Constitutional Convention delegates resolve the issue of small and large state tensions, uh, and which this proposal of prayer eventually failing. You write that, quote, this was the most remarkable religious episode of Franklin's life. It was stunning, close quote. Now, I pay attention to superlatives. You use a superlative here. You use the word stunning. Why do you say that, Tommy?
Well, it's arguably the most important moment with regard to religion at the Constitutional Convention, and you would have expected that it would be one of the traditional Christians, an evangelical delegate, who would have been proposing that they open sessions with prayer, but no, it's the deist Franklin.
Yeah.
And so um, it just shows so well the enigmatic nature of his faith, that he has rejected essential Christian doctrines, and yet by that time in 1787 he's such a providentialist that he believes that it not only will it help if they pray, and part of that is because if you pray with people together, it's harder to fight with them. But I think he thinks that prayer, God will help them get through the impasses of the convention if they pray, and so that's what he thinks, and so he proposes prayer. And as he said, there are very few delegates who support the motion, and a variety of reasons possibly why that was. But Franklin was really frustrated about it. I mean, we have his manuscript of his speech, and he writes at the bottom of it that except for two or three delegates, the members of the convention thought prayers unnecessary, and he underlines it and has like triple exclamation points. I mean, he's really mad at the rest of the convention for not supporting this motion. Why won't you pray? Why are you being so stubborn?
Yeah.
Why are we ignoring God and his providence, who's brought us through all these terrible experiences and suffering and everything? So it's poignant, it's strange, it's surprising, it's
Yeah.
I'm not surprised that somebody would propose prayer, but in a way, Franklin is the last person you would think who would propose prayer, and yet there he is, and they reject it.
Yeah. No, thank you for that. Okay, so tell us what he thought of God's providence in the Constitution. You have a section in your book where you say he doesn't believe it was divinely inspired, yet he believes certain things about providence and the Constitution. What's the story here, Tommy?
Yeah, well, I mean, he and Madison, who is not given to these kind of statements. I mean, they all pretty much, in moments of reflection, say, who can fail to see the hand of God in all that has happened? I mean, the improbable victory in the war and getting the states together to create the Constitution and the raising up of Washington as the head of the military and then our first president. And I mean, it turns them to thinking about, the Old Testament's question, can a nation be born in a day? I mean, then they say this vindicates that a nation can be born in a day. And so, yeah, I mean, they don't tend to think that somehow the Constitution is, certainly not dictated by God. It's not that kind of providentialism.
Right.
It just the weight of events, I think, for Franklin shows that clearly God is working here somehow in a special way to raise up the American nation. And that I think that was, I don't know that Jefferson says things like that, but most of the major founders do think something along those lines.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay, second to last question here, and we'll wrap it up. Um, you report that on his deathbed, again, something I'd never heard, that Franklin asked for a picture of the Day of Judgment to be placed at the foot of his bed, with some souls going off to the right and some to the left into everlasting fire. Uh, so this might not be true. You say it might be, but talk to us a bit about this anecdote and what you think it means and doesn't mean, and if it's significant for our understanding of Franklin's religion.
Yeah, and I'd say, from I think I opened the paragraph with, let's assume this is true.
Right.
Because we don't know, and there's other versions of the anecdote about, a picture of Jesus on the cross or something like that. So, um, it, I'm not saying it's true. However, it is such a intriguing story, and it does come up often enough that I think there was some painting
Good.
with a Christian theme that he asked to be placed at the foot of his bed. And whether or not it's true, I think that I'm imagining Franklin on his deathbed. I mean, and what we do know is that 6 weeks before he dies, he's asked by Ezra Stiles, the president of Yale, what he thinks about Jesus. And, he tells him, he lays out those basic beliefs that he has, but then he says, I'd never have been sure about whether Jesus is the Son of God. And so we know, at least within 6 weeks of his death, that he's thinking about those issues. And I think it's normal when you're on your deathbed to think about those sorts of things. And he's gone through a lifetime of his parents and George Whitefield and Jane Meacom saying, you need to believe in Christianity. Virtue is not enough. You need to believe. I mean, that you believing what God has told us about the gospel and salvation by grace alone and what Jesus did for us on the cross, you know, that's the key to salvation. That's what God has told us. And so we're pleading with you to believe. And I just have to believe that he, on his deathbed, in quiet moments, had thoughts like that about, who's been right here? And he tells Ezra Stiles, I'm going to find out who's right here
Right. Yeah.
pretty soon. So we'll see. And obviously Franklin, like everybody, tends to think he's right, and that the others haven't been right, at least not about everything.
Yeah.
But you have to, if that's true about the final judgment, you have to wonder what his kind of last thoughts were like about those things.
Yeah, which we don't know, right?
We don't know.
Okay, as we conclude, do you want to share, Tommy, any further insights, lessons, or takeaways from Franklin and his religion, either in terms of important historical transformations you have noticed, or in terms of helping us better understand Franklin, his religion, and or our present moment in the American narrative?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think Franklin is another example of how difficult it is to just pigeonhole the founders as kind of all Christian or all secular, and polemicists, today want to do, one or the other of those things. And so, Christian partisans would want to turn Franklin into a Christian and say, well, look, he proposed prayer at the Constitutional Convention. Surely he must have been a Christian. He knows the Bible really well. Surely he must have been a Christian. And then secularists, will say, well, look, I mean, he was, speculating about polytheism, and
Right.
I mean,
Right.
he's wildly skeptical. And I think with him, with Jefferson, and this is partly why I did both of those, biographies, is to just show that, once you think you've got them nailed down, I mean, then they do something that seems really contrary. And so you have this deistic providentialist, this, radical skeptic who goes on to propose prayer at the convention. And so, these polemical, zero-sum kind of readings of the founders just don't stand up to the historical complexity that we see in them, especially with regard to religion.
Yep. Okay. Well said. We appreciate all your expertise, Tommy. So we have been speaking with Thomas S. Kidd, research professor of church history at Midwestern Baptist Theological Seminary and author of Benjamin Franklin, The Religious Life of a Founding Father, which was the subject of today's podcast. Tommy, thanks so much once again for giving us of your time and hard-earned understanding and knowledge. This was fantastic. It's been about an hour, and I honestly believe this hour has helped each of us be better equipped to be more effective stewards of religion's role in perpetuating the American experiment in self-government.
Thanks, Chris.
Religion in the American Experience is produced by the private Digital First National Museum of American Religion. Scholarly support is provided by Dr. Lauren Turek, and audio and video assistance by Dr. Randall Stevens. The music was composed by Evan Chamberlain.